But tonight we are very honored to have former CIA and National Archives member David Rudgers here with us talking about his book, Creating the Secret State. For those of you who, like me, are devotees of PBS cooking shows, the CIA here, of course, is the Central Intelligence Agency and not the Culinary Institute of America. So if any of you have made that mistake, we do ask that you still stay and listen. But a lot has been written about the CIA, but not too much on how it was created and what the truth behind the creation of the CIA is. And there's a lot of myths and misunderstandings about it. So to help us shed some light and understand this agency a little better is Mr. David Rudgers.
Thank you. And thank you all for turning out on the first day of summer. It warms the heart of an old bureaucrat to see people turn out to hear him shoot his mouth off. Since Washington, the literary scene here is full of books about insiders on government activities, perhaps my book fits into that kind of genre. Although I write about an activity that the government became involved in some 60 years ago, the founding of the Central Intelligence Agency. Now, it's what I call the founding myth of the Central Intelligence Agency, that the organization was the unique brainchild of Wild Bill Donovan, the director of the Wartime Office of Strategic Services, and that he fought his creation through to reality over the objections of a large number of troglodytes within the government, and that the CIA is the direct lineal heir of the OSS. Well, the truth, in fact, is a little bit more prosaic. The fact is that the Central Intelligence Agency came about as a result of a perceived institutional need among government policymakers for some sort of intelligence coordination after World War II. Wild Bill Donovan himself had nothing to do with the establishment of the Central Intelligence Organization, and there was no intention at any time to recreate the wartime OSS. That the CIA eventually became something looking like the wartime OSS was essentially a series of coincident events which came about against the background of the emerging Cold War. Now, I first came on this topic a number of years ago when I was working down the street at the National Archives. I had no idea at the time that I'd ever be in the CIA. And I was involved in one of the first projects of the U.S. government to declassify all the classified records that the government had generated during and since World War II. This has since become a major cottage industry in the federal government. And I was very surprised to see all the documents that the reviewers were turning up on the establishment of a post-war intelligence system. And I was interested enough in this topic to want to pursue some research in it, which the National Archives allowed me to do. And I poked around in the other records in the National Archives, in the Bureau of the Budget, the War and Navy Departments, the State Department, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and also various obscure congressional hearings that were also housed in the National Archives. I knew the literature at the time, such that it was, and I also knew the glorious history of Wild Bill Donovan and the OSS. And of course, what struck me at the time was that how little Wild Bill Donovan actually had to do with the process. So when I completed taking my notes and started writing up a manuscript, I found I had this monstrosity on my hands that was too long for an article and too short for a book, and I eventually had to put the whole project aside to deal with the exigencies of raising a family. and came back to it around at the beginning of the 1990s when my wife and I acquired a country house in the bucolic Virginia countryside in the Shenandoah Valley, and that was my writer's retreat. In the process, I had left the National Archives and gone to work at the Central Intelligence Agency, where I spent the next 22 years mainly as an editor and an intelligence analyst. And while at the CIA, I was, of course, hit right in the face with the Donovan cult of personality, which is very pronounced, and it is even more pronounced now than then. And I also came across the sacred text of the Donovan cult of personality, a book called Donovan and the CIA, a history of the establishment of the Central Intelligence Agency by a contractor named Thomas Troy. That's the gentleman referred to on the blurb on the back of the book. I read Mr. Troy's book, though, and although he was an excellent researcher, he did not write a book about the founding of the CIA. What he wrote a book about was the adventures of Wild Bill Donovan in darkest wartime Washington, with several superficial chapters added at the end as an afterthought. And I also, so after I resumed my work, I finished the records at the National Archives that I hadn't looked at before, including, I should add, the working papers of Thomas Troy that had been retired to the archives by the CIA, and if he had used all that material that he collected, I wouldn't be standing here talking tonight, as a matter of fact, but he saved me a great deal of effort. I also explored various other sets of records. I went down to the University of Virginia Library, which is just over the hill from Harrisonburg, and they used the papers of Secretary of State Edward Stettinius, which were a very valuable source for early State Department thinking. Chapter 4 of my book is about the State Department and its involvement in the issue. And I made a pilgrimage up to the Army Historical Institute in Carlisle Barracks to look at the Donovan papers. They were interesting, but not earth-shaking. And unlike the Stettinius papers, they were in very poor condition. So if there are anybody here who wants to honor Mr. Donovan, they should land on the Army very hard to put those papers into some kind of order and proper condition before they completely disintegrate. And I spent a very pleasant week at the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri, and I was fortunate enough when the State Department published a volume in its what's called its Foreign Relations series on the establishment of the post-war Central Intelligence System in this country. That was 1,000 pages of documents, most of which had never seen the light of day before. And so out of all this research came the book, and my basic conclusion that I stated, that Wild Bill Donovan did not have any role in the establishment of the Central Intelligence Agency. This is not a throat-grabbing revelation to a lot of historians, I suppose, but I can guarantee around the Central Intelligence Agency it's a view somewhat akin to treason, blasphemy, and sacrilege. But no historian has bothered addressing this issue the way as I did in any of their books, and some of them, like John Ronley, who wrote the only complete history of the CIA, did a great deal to perpetrate this founding myth. What happened was this: when the World War II entered its terminal phase, the United States was clearly emerging as the first power in the world. So the issue of how would the United States manage its new responsibilities became a very important one in the government and among the general public. And there was essentially a division of labor. The State Department focused on the issues of international affairs, multinational activities, which through things like the United Nations and the Bretton Woods organizations that it set up. While the military establishment, the War and Navy departments and the Joint Chiefs of Staff focused on how the government would cope with what we call today national security management. And of course, since legislation would be required, Congress was very much involved in this, in a variety of hearings and studies. And out of this interest emerged what was essentially an executive legislative consensus on how the new system should be set up. And this consensus was a series of ideas loosely based on the British War Cabinet system. There would be so-called unification of the armed forces under some sort of Department of National Defense. The Joint Chiefs of Staff would be legally established by law, and there would be an interagency council which would deal with coordinating and bringing together the diplomatic, military, and other activities that go into foreign policy making. And this council would be served by a variety of specialized bodies for scientific research and development, war mobilization, and central intelligence coordination. This clearest statement of this came with the so-called Eberstadt report of September 1945. This was prepared by a New York banker and businessman named Ferdinand Eberstadt at the direction of Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, who acted on a suggestion by the chairman of the Senate Naval Affairs Committee, Senator Walsh of Massachusetts. This is the clearest statement publicly of a proposal for a central intelligence agency. They used that very term as part of a national security management system. And to show how the executive branch reacted to this, I have to back up a little bit and point out that the war required that the Army and Navy work together on a variety of things, and they did this through all sorts of joint boards and committees, including joint intelligence committees. The primary one was attached to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And being sensible men, they decided that this would be carried over into the post-war, and also that they took this view because of what Dean Acheson later referred to as a defensive alliance against William J. Donovan and the OSS, because Donovan, although he headed what was essentially a temporary agency, he had very clear ambitions of post-war permanence, and his organization was a very freewheeling outfit, and together the man in the organization had their feet in just about every plate in Washington. And the upshot of all this came on October the 23rd, 1944, when the Joint Chiefs of Staff issued a paper called Post-War Intelligence Policy of the United States. This is the first official statement of policy for calling for a post-war Central Intelligence Agency. Again, that was the name, which would be which would be subordinate to a National Intelligence Council made up of the Secretaries of State, War, Navy, and a representative of Joint Chiefs of Staff. It had very specific, very limited powers, and this was put forward as the official position of the military establishment at the time. However, Donovan, of course, saw a real challenge to his own views of post-war Central Intelligence. So he decided to play his ace in the hole, which was presidential patronage. So he lobbied Franklin Roosevelt for a request to present his views, and such a request was forthcoming. And on November 18th, 1944, about 3 weeks after the JCS, he submitted to President Roosevelt a document called The Basis for a Permanent U.S. Foreign Intelligence Service. And this was essentially calling for a post-war OSS, which was doing a variety of things, intelligence analysis, secret intelligence collection, covert propaganda, and something Donovan called subversive operations abroad, which today we know as covert activity. And Donovan, just to try and get FDR to present his opponents with a fait accompli, included a draft directive to set the thing up, which he hoped Roosevelt would do with what he did in 1942 with the OSS. This time FDR didn't buy into it. He merely referred Donovan's proposal to the Joint Chiefs of Staff for consideration through his military deputy, Admiral William D. Leahy. Naturally, the Joint Chiefs of Staff didn't care for the proposal at all. They fell back on their own plan and specifically didn't like this talk about subversive operations abroad. So while the debate was going on, Donovan was seething, and the issue was resolved in perhaps a real classic Washington fashion, a press leak. In February 1945, somebody passed the Donovan proposal and the Joint Chiefs of Staff proposals to a very vocal anti-administration journalist named Walter Trohan, who published a series of very lurid articles about it in the old Washington Times-Herald, which was a very strident anti-administration newspaper. And this essentially ended consideration of the proposals. Donovan was furious, and you read I quote correspondence that he wrote to the president on this. He never caught on to the fact that the man who was responsible for the leak was Franklin Roosevelt himself. But as things do in Washington, this blew over, and to mollify Donovan, the president decided that he should resubmit his proposals to the cabinet's secretaries for consideration again in April. And Donovan dutifully did so and flew off to Europe. FDR headed off to Warm Springs, Georgia. And on April 12, 1945, the 4 senior cabinet officers met in what is now the Executive Office building right across the street from the White House to consider this proposal. They, in the course of their meeting, they rejected Donovan's proposals again outright and decided that they'd start over from scratch. In the course of the meeting, Secretary of State Stettinius received a phone call to come over to the White House, and there he was told that Franklin Roosevelt had just died. That ended the meeting. That ended Donovan's dreams for the future right then and there. We all know that Truman, in September, abolished the OSS essentially as a temporary government organization. Its functions were distributed between the War Department and the State Department, and at this point, as I like to point out, this removed Donovan completely from the policy-making any policy-making activities. He plays, except for some marginal kibitzing, he plays no further role in the establishment of a Central Intelligence Agency. Why? Because he was out of step with the legislative executive consensus, and Truman didn't like him anyway. So that was he was essentially, he could perhaps be considered the godfather, but like Moses, he remained outside the promised land and could only look in. So, but there was still an interest in some sort of central intelligence organization in the government. And Truman, when he abolished the OSS, had said that had directions to Secretary of State Burns that the State Department should take the lead. Well, as I describe in Chapter 4, the State Department blew its opportunity to become the chief foreign intelligence organization of the United States government through a variety of internal disputes over how the department's intelligence organization was going to be organized. And in the meantime, what happened was in September of 1945, as the OSS was breathing its last, Admiral Leahy revived the Joint Chiefs of Staff proposal and submitted it to the White House through the War and Navy Department. And this proposal was in line with the thinking of Secretary of the Navy Forrestal, and also with the people in the War Department, and the two departments supported this plan and fought it through the bureaucratic system, as I describe in Chapter 5, against other proposals. There was one from the Justice Department and from the Bureau of the Budget that was sort of very much also RAND's, but there was quite a fight over one that was proposed by the State Department. And in the end, on January, I put the date down here, January 22nd, 1946, Truman issued a directive establishing the new Central Intelligence Agency, a new Central Intelligence system. It was essentially a slightly revised form of what the Joint Chiefs of Staff had urged. Instead of a Joint Chiefs of Staff representative, there would be a personal representative of the President of the United States. That would be William D. Leahy. And this intelligence organization was called the Central Intelligence Group, and it was responsible to a National Intelligence Authority made up of Leahy and the three cabinet secretaries. And this organization was responsible, got its personnel and its funding from the three cabinet offices. So, and Truman, as his first Director of Central Intelligence, appointed a man named Sidney Sowers, who was such a low-key operator that it's easy to overlook how important he was. He was a businessman who was called to active duty in the Navy and rose to the Rear Admiral and became deputy of ONI, Office of Naval Intelligence. And he was a Missourian, and although he was never a crony of Truman's, he was the kind of man Truman really trusted. And even in his very short tenure, he got the basic authorities down and set the wheels of organization in motion that his successor could build upon. And he was most shrewd in picking his successor, a man named General Hoyt Vandenberg, who was a dashing Army flyboy and very energetic, very able man. And even though he was only in the position of Director of Central Intelligence a short time, he was a man who knew how to make hay while the sun was shining. And because the government was retrenching, he went about and ingathered everything dealing with intelligence that he could find from anybody. He got the remnants of the OSS secret intelligence units back from the Army, and got the responsibility for atomic energy intelligence again from the Army because they had to get rid of it. And he even bested J. Edgar Hoover in a bureaucratic battle, which is indeed something Bill Donovan never managed to do. So he in a real sense is a founder of the CIA. However, the CIG suffered from its problems with not having its own budget and personnel system, and also it wasn't legal because it wasn't backed by legislation. So this became the next issue for the national security managers that I mention in that I discuss in chapter 8 of my book. This of course, like many things do in Washington, led to a bureaucratic fight. Vandenberg and the so-called intelligence professionals wanted a piece of freestanding legislation that specifically set up a central intelligence agency by itself, while the basic White House position was to build, essentially put the Central Intelligence Agency in the context of a broader national security management system. And so this led to a rather nasty bureaucratic fight between Vandenberg and the man who was responsible for writing the legislation, a chap named Clark Clifford, who I think everybody in this room has heard of. And Clifford, of course, won, and the upshot was the National Security Act of July 26, 1947, and on September 18, 1947, the Central Intelligence Agency opened for business. Now, I couldn't leave it just at this point, thinking, well, the millennia has arrived, so we need no longer look at it, because the CIA that was described in the enabling legislation of 1947 bears no resemblance to the CIA that it developed in the post-war years and exists today. So in chapter 9 of my book, I picked the 4 episodes that I think explain why the CIA became what it did and what it now is, based on against the background of the Cold War. The first was the investigations of 1948 that were prompted by the growing pains that the CIA suffered. These investigations, one by the Hoover Commission, the first Hoover Commission of the Congress, and the second by an internal executive committee headed by Allen Dulles, again a figure I don't have to say much about in this town. And these 2 studies laid out the base, what was considered what a good intelligence organization ought to be. The second major episode was the passage in 1949 of the law describing the mission and function and responsibilities of the CIA, separate from the rest of the national security establishment, which is what the CIA had wanted to begin with, and that basically established the authority of the Central Intelligence Agency to be a secret intelligence organization, particularly where money is concerned, and money is the root of all things, particularly when governance is concerned. The third episode, which I describe in chapter 9 and also in a spin-off article that I've written, is the invention of covert operations as a standard foreign policy tool of the American government, which was consistently used during the Cold War as an instrument of American overseas engagement. And the fourth incident was the incumbency of General Walter Bedell Smith as Director of Central Intelligence. Vandenberg was succeeded by a Navy admiral named Roscoe Hillenkotter, who was a good sailor, but certainly not a very good player in the Washington power game, and not a good spy master, so he rose without a trace. However, Smith was essentially the drill master of the Central Intelligence Agency, because he gave it its present form, structure, and mission, and essentially its marching orders. So at this point, with Smith's tenure, the CIA became the modern organization that it has remained. And these these four events, as I conclude in my book, led to the CIA basically being transformed from an intelligence gathering organization to an instrument of fighting the Cold War, to project American foreign policy, and as some irreverent people would say, sort of the goon squad of American hegemony. So, and this of course gave Donovan the ultimate victory in the fight over intelligence organization, but it was a partial victory because the other branches of government still, particularly in the military establishment, still retained their own intelligence organizations. So the CIA was never as supreme as Donovan dreamed it to be. And also Donovan's victory, as I conclude in my book, was a victory loaded with irony, because since the CIA became essentially a Cold War fighting instrument, when the Cold War ended so unexpectedly and the evil empire collapsed of its own accord, the Central Intelligence Agency was left without a role, without a real mission. And it's now faced with the problem of reinventing itself. And this problem was exacerbated because these events on the international scene occurred amid massive scandals within the CIA. So there was no sense of triumphalism, mainly a sense of uncertainty and foreboding within the CIA. I was there. I could see it. You could almost cut it. But but I will say that the present incumbent, as the Director of Central Intelligence, George Tenet, is well aware of this problem, is well aware of the fact that the CIA has to reinvent itself, or it not only will cease to be useful, it might even cease to exist. However, Mr. Tenet has made very clear in numerous speeches and public statements that under his brilliant leadership, the corner has been turned, and the great new days are ahead. I don't know. I'm retired now, so this may be the case, but only time will tell. And thank you. And if I'll take any questions if you have some. Yes, sir. This man in the back there. You. Yes.
Yes. Hear me?
You. Yeah.
Okay. I have two questions. One dealing with the original period from 40 to 45, at which time Ho Chi Minh was cooperating with American intelligence in getting information on the Japanese intrusions into French Indochina, now which later became, of course, mainly in Vietnam. And my question is, was the relative disorganization and conflict of the role of intelligence adversely affect our ability to understand what was going on in Vietnam at that time, and whether we made serious mistakes? The second question has to do with fighting the Cold War. It is my understanding in 67 to 70, when Biafra became independent of Nigeria, the CIA supported Biafra, but in the end, Kissinger and the State Department overruled them and said that we must maintain stability above all, and that no breakups are to be allowed, and that has been the consistent policy pretty much ever since, that this was a turning point in Biafra. I want your opinion on
Well, basically, when French Indochina during World War II was pretty much terra incognita to American policymakers. FDR basically said he didn't want the French going back. But the OSS was operating all over creation where they could get somebody in. And in the closing days of World War II, they did have people in Vietnam, essentially, and there was a man named Archimedes Patty who was meeting with Ho Chi Minh and was actually there when they proclaimed independence the first time in Hanoi. And Patty, of course, has written a good book. He died a couple of years ago, called Why Vietnam, describing one of the several describing those events, and he was there for a lot of it. And basically, the OSS was sympathetic to the Vietnamese nationalism, but the government, of course, as the Cold War came along, took a pro-French spin, and the old ideas of letting Vietnam go were abandoned simply out of Cold War necessity. As far as Biafra goes, that was in the 60s. I don't think Kissinger was doing much then. But the U.S. government did support the independence of Nigeria because, like you say, it was U.S. policy to try and keep these countries together, because once they start falling apart, nothing stops them. And, of course, the French, just sort of international kibitzing, were involved, did promote Biafran independence, but not enough to really fully help them. And of course we were bogging down in Indochina at the time, so we pretty much let the British call the tunes as far as Biafra go. There's a good book on the Nigerian Civil War, came out a number of years ago, called I think The Brothers' War by John D. St. Jaffe or something like that. It's a very good sort of instant history account of the war in Nigeria. But it has, like you say, it has been the policy of the United States to back the territorial integrity of any of these countries, simply because the alternative is complete disintegration. Sharon, you had a question, yes?
In '50, and when the Korean War started, why wasn't the CIA more effective, and why didn't we win and finalize the Korean conflict?
Well, because one thing, Douglas MacArthur kept the CIA out of Japan, just like he kept it out of his South Pacific Theater during the OSS, out of the South Pacific Theater in World War II. He didn't like anybody's intelligence officers except his own, and he had a man and his intelligence chief was a boob who spent most of his time looking for subversives in Japan, and of course down to 1950 we wrote off Korea, and then suddenly just changed our minds when the war broke out, and rather than risk a larger war, we were willing to settle for what some would call a standoff and others would call a defensive victory in Korea. Yes, yes, go ahead.
Tom Troy,
yes,
who I understand you had a debate with at the archives.
Yes.
What was his response to what you are presenting in your book?
Great indignation. He objected very much to the quote on the back of the book from Wesley Wark, and I told him that I did not put Wark up to saying that, and he apparently doesn't play bridge because he didn't know what out-trumped meant. And then he praised his own book volubly, and demanded to know why, after thriving for 22 years at the CIA, I was so iconoclastic, and why I had such a liberal bias. And I said I make no apologies for any liberal bias, and afterward I'm iconoclastic because I spent 22 years at CIA on the shop floor with the working stiffs, and as Yogi Berra used to say, you can see a lot by looking. So, any other questions? Yes, sir, gentleman in the back.
Yeah, what was your observation as far as the early interaction between the CIA and the elites around the world, as far as academics and artists and scholars? I don't know if you had a reaction to the recent book by Francis Stoner Saunders.
Yes, I have. I just picked the book up. I haven't read it yet, and it's an old story. Basically, Saunders, I think, has her facts right, but she takes a slightly hysterical tone. In my view, this is one time when the CIA was sort of on the right, doing the right thing, because the Cold War did have a cultural element to it, and being the patron of the arts is not a bad thing to do, as long as the degree of control is on what the artists do is not major, and trying to control those kind of artists that the CIA was secretly supporting was like herding squirrels. It's a rather difficult thing to do, and it's probably no odder than Edsel Ford subsidizing Diego Rivera, the Mexican communist painter. Maybe it does bother people who don't like the idea of government and arts, and particularly secret manipulation, but in the context of the time, perhaps it was understandable, and to my mind, it's a lot better than supporting death squads in Central America, or training the Iranian secret police how to torture people or things like that. Compared to some of or giving people drugs without telling them, I mean, some things are quite unsavory. This is not too bad.
Are you aware of any influence on religious leaders?
Well, I imagine a lot of religious leaders did talk with CIA personnel at one time or another, and and of course the Catholic Church, of course, at the time was very militantly anti-communist in the 50s. I mean, Cardinal Spellman was a leading political figure as well as a religious leader, probably more the former than the latter, I think, on some occasions. So I don't doubt that he knew various people, and John McCone was a very prominent lay Catholic leader. So these connections get around. As far as who is passing money to whom, I really don't know. Another question? Yes, sir.
You mentioned in reply to my question that you admitted that the U.S. government has been supporting stability around the world. Do you think it's justified now that the Cold War is over for 10 years? Shouldn't we support nations that want to be independent of oppression by another nation within a territorial state? Why should we be so concerned anymore about breakup of huge states that are repressing the people within it? Shouldn't we reverse our policy, or do you agree with the continuation of the stability position?
Well, I don't even think Madeleine Albright has a good answer for that one, so I'm not sure I can come up with it. It is a new wrinkle for American policymakers to have to face problems like this, of these new emerging of ethnic nationalism within countries. But here again, if you support it, how far do you push it? We could Turkey. We could support it. Kurdish independence in Iraq, for instance. But it's the Turkish Kurds that are the most that are also very obstreperous, and Turkey is an ally, and of course.
What do we need him for an ally anymore?
Because it's better to have friends than enemies, I suppose. And of course, how far are we going to push it? Are we going to back Quebec independence with Canada, a country which we always have independence? Well, here again, we could have a lovely policy making. This is the issue that I can't solve it tonight. And if I could, I'd be writing my Nobel Peace Prize speech. But it is the how narrowly do you split these issues is a basic issue of foreign post-Cold War foreign policy that nobody has solved yet. So I certainly don't have a solution for it tonight. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Someone mentioned to me recently something about the Korean War, in that the British informed the Chinese that the U.S. would not use atomic weapons if the Chinese entered the war. Have you heard anything about that?
Well, no, I haven't. To tell you the truth. But it did become, when Truman when the front in Korea collapsed and MacArthur lost his nerve and everybody was panicking in Washington, Truman, as we know, was very made elliptical references to using atomic weapons, and Attlee came flying across the Atlantic and because to help himself politically. But whether the British went back channel or not, I have no idea. But this question was an important one for a short period of time in around 50-51 there, before the front line was stabilized again. Jack, yes.
Yes, you were mentioning delineating the growth of CIA. Truman didn't like Donovan, and so forth and so on. The heyday seemed to be about 1952, when you had Eisenhower, who leaned on John Foster Dulles, whose brother was head of CIA, whose sister was head of the German desk, and budget problems for CIA, no problem at all, unlimited.
And of course, General Smith was also Under Secretary of State. Right. Yes, the 50s is the golden age of the CIA. We look back on it. I was working when I left. It was still the age of lead, so it was looked back on with a great deal of nostalgia. And the Peter Gross's biography of Dulles gives of Allen Dulles gives a real sense of that period. But those were the halcyon days when the station chiefs were proconsuls and didn't give a damn about what the ambassador thought, and wheeling and dealing. And of course, the crows came home to roost eventually. But those were the days when the old timers want to wallow in nostalgia. That's what most of them are dead by now, but they did for a long time. I knew some of them when I first started working at CIA, and so those were the great golden days of the CIA, the 50s, certainly. Yes, ma'am.
How would you evaluate William Casey as a director?
As a director, well, Casey was sort of, I sort of look on him sort of as a Republican Joe Kennedy. He was a very able, hardworking, highly intelligent, crafty man, just like Joe Kennedy. Like Joe Kennedy, he didn't have and he was probably the last strong director of the CIA that we had, at least the last one prior to George Tenet, in Tenet's estimation. But he was the last strong leader the CIA, I think, ever had. Unfortunately, he didn't have a scrap of integrity, and he was a ardent cold warrior. So where he led the CIA was off a cliff, and today at the bottom of that cliff you can find the credibility and the institutional integrity of the CIA in ruins, because he brought about. Of course, the CIA, at least elements of it, were willing to be led off that cliff. But he sort of saw himself as the new Donovan, to lead the CIA against the new evil empire, the way Donovan had led the OSS against the old evil empire, and things didn't work out quite as anticipated, and he essentially, the CIA institutionally paid a very high price for his conduct as director. I think some would say that had he not died, he might have been under indictment for perjury and conspiracy. But of course, it's very easy to dump on Bill Casey because he's dead. But a lot of the problems that since came along were due to him. He was a throwback to the golden age, like I was talking to Jack about. He was a throwback to the 50s, and the 50s were over, and he didn't realize it, and that's basically even when I retired, the CIA was still paying the price for what Bill Casey did. Yes, sir, in the back.
How would you characterize the relationship between the FBI and the CIA from its beginnings to the current day? And I'm wondering if you would say anything more about J. Edgar Hoover. You do portray him in the book as being very reluctant to get into this coordination effort, except until he was ordered by Roosevelt, and you portray him as very protective of his own turf.
Well, he always was. He was not a man who gave up power once he got it. He was a good bureaucrat. He'd follow orders, but once he got his marching orders, they could have been from Coolidge, and until anybody specifically repealed them, he went by them, and he had his foreign intelligence apparatus in Latin America, and he knew he essentially felt he had to give it up when the Justice Department scheme wasn't accepted for a post-war organization. But he did not like the idea of giving it up, and he made life very unpleasant and essentially left a lot of empty file drawers behind him when he abandoned his intelligence network in Latin America. And subsequently, relations between the CIA and the FBI are almost the sort of the negotiation between two sovereign countries, which try to get along because they must. And it's, of course, because Hoover's gone now, things are probably rather easier. And of course, nowadays with various subjects such as international crime and terrorism becoming national security issues, the foreign involvement of the FBI is increasing again in a fashion that would make J. Edgar Hoover very happy, at the expense of the CIA. So it's always been a very, and of course people would hang medals on J. Edgar Hoover just sort of to mollify him. So it was a very contentious relationship with him because he was something to a strong portion of American political society. He was something of an icon, and it's always hard to deal with a national monument. So things are probably more settled now, and in fact, like I mentioned, the FBI is gaining ground at CIA's expense when it comes to foreign operations. Yes, sir.
In terms of effectiveness and capability, how would you rank the CIA amongst intelligence agencies in the world?
I'd rank it quite high. It's, of course, whether what you're going to do, what you're allowed to do, and what you feel the need to do, and some things one's discovered one can't do, like assassinating people. The KGB or Mossad doesn't have those constraints, and some things, the contributions, of course, of the CIA are often in the eye of the beholder, but the real American skill in intelligence activities are the technical aspects, and the CIA was a leader in such things as overhead reconnaissance technology, and so, of course, by Washington logic, the overhead reconnaissance responsibilities then go to the Defense Department. But then this is Washington. So, but and of course, old spooks have told me how hard it is to convince Americans that they should go out and spy on other people when they're training case officers. But I've known case officers, and generally they are a dedicated, conscientious lot. And remember, it's always the political establishment that sets the tone for what the CIA can and can't do. People have said that the CIA is a rogue elephant. Well, to use the pachyderm analogy, it's an elephant driven by a rogue mahout, the President of the United States. And so this is the sort of thing that has to be kept in mind. Sharon again.
I think you partly answered my question. Was the CIA ever involved with the McCarthy period and the communist witch hunts of Joseph McCarthy, and were they ever involved with the infiltration of the anti-Vietnam protest movement, or was that all FBI?
Well, they're the two great. Basically, the CIA came out sort of on the side of the angels with McCarthy because he was started when in his glory days he started to poke around with the CIA, and unlike Brother John, Allen Dulles told him to go bug off, and President Eisenhower backed Dulles, so the CIA for that period of time became something of a liberal hero. And as far as the anti-war movement goes, it's known now that the CIA did look at examine foreign connections of the anti-war movement. This is one of those gray areas where you're crossing between foreign and domestic intelligence and law enforcement. And of course, as Richard Helms sometimes likes to point out, when an American goes overseas, they turn up as a blip on the radar screen because if anybody goes abroad and starts talking to a legitimate intelligence target, then they get noticed, and that can be Angela Davis or Congresswoman Abzug or anyone. If they're talking to a foreign intelligence target, then they're going to get noticed, and their material things on them turn up in the files, and this is later something of an embarrassment. But that's sort of that is essentially what happened with the CIA. Yes, sir.
There's been some talk in recent last few months or a year or two, in view of the history of J. Edgar Hoover and his rather extreme measures that he took for his own protection and so on, and then the action of the FBI at Waco and Ruby Ridge and Oklahoma City and so on. There's been some consideration of the Attorney General and the FBI, which are loggerheads also, that there be some type of a Federal Reserve system of long-term appointments to the Justice Department and FBI, so that sort of a group would make policy in this area. Have you heard any of this, or do you think any? What do you think of that idea?
In fact, I mentioned something in my book about that because Allen Dulles, when he was made his statement to Congress about 1947, said that the head of the CIA ought to be a long-term appointee, sort of like a judge, above politics, and of course J. Edgar Hoover was in place for decades and decades, because, and when he died was the first effort to make that a post, the director of FBI, to be confirmed by the Senate, because these ideas were always there, but in.
I had the idea of a committee making policy, like the Federal Reserve System meets once a month and decides economic policy. That kind of a concept.
Well, there is an intelligence community type of organization, and the old line, a camel is a horse designed by a committee. So this committee, and there is committees of intelligence or senior intelligence people do meet, and the titular head of it is the Director of Central Intelligence. But it's he does not give orders to anyone, and of course many of the agents, particularly in the Defense Department, the intelligence resources of the Defense Department dwarf the entire CIA. So this committee structure is there in place, and even as we speak, and it works no better than things usually work in Washington, I suppose. It would be asking a lot of it, if I suppose, to expect it to function well, because bureaucratic interests are what they are. Even the great German General Staff didn't function all that well. So this system is in place, and there's a big staff to manage it. So that exists at the present time. Yes, sir. Again.
Do you think there's much mutual respect among CIA, KGB, and professionals in other nations? What do they think of each other?
Well, it depends on the organization. Former KGB and retired CIA officers are getting together to write books, and they sit around and they probably talk about the good old days and things like that. And require cooperation, and of course, a lot of the current issues of intelligence concern do require a great deal of cooperation between countries. So liaison is always a very important activity between people, and technically you're not supposed to spy on your friends, and it happens, but like with the Pollard case, there's always some kind of stink, and the Pollard case is a particularly awful one, an awful example of what you're not supposed to do blows up in your face. But the old guys in any profession like to get together, I suppose, and reminisce about old times. Probably they thought differently when things were hot, but there are stories about the international old boy networks that are still around that I've heard over the years. So any other questions?
Mr. Putin, with his background now being the number one guy in Russia.
Oh yeah, well he's one of those even the reformers like Gorbachev relied on the KGB to do his will. That sort of Russia, eternal Russia kind of things. Of course, the funny irony is that the CIA headquarters compound is now called the George Bush Center for Intelligence or something like that by legislative enactment, and because he was DCI for about 11 months, but he was a man who was well liked, and when times were bad, he always had a bad thing to say about the Washington Post, and that made everybody very happy. So he's still very, very popular out there. So, yes, David.
Did you have any trouble getting your text approved by the CIA to publish this book?
None at all, really. This is ancient history. Almost prehistoric times. There's not a lot of historical consciousness at the CIA, and the CIA learned by suffering that you can't use the review process censorship anymore. So with a story this ancient, I really didn't have any problems. Now somebody like a case officer who wants to write his memoirs, that's a different ball of wax. But the review process by struggle has become a much more better thought out process than it was 5-10 years ago.
Did you hear any feedback about Ted Gupp's investigations into the deaths that had been unidentified?
Well, it's not the sort of, I do know from reading that it's not the sort of story that the information he talks about is not the kind of thing that the CIA wanted out. And he, of course, not being a CIA employee, he didn't have to get his book cleared. So but I don't think it's going to be a book that's going to be sold at the employee store out at Langley anytime soon. I wouldn't mind if mine was, but I don't think his is going to be any time. Any more questions?
I think that wraps it up for the evening.
Okay.
Thank you all for coming. Again, there are books by the door, and Mr. Rudgers will be happy to sign your copies for you.
Absolutely. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I certainly appreciate it.
Get this out of your way.
Excuse me. No, I don't.
Well, they're not according to thing you talk to her.
Forrestal's biography, you'll probably find there. He didn't live in Haiti. He understood what he was doing.